Have you ever wondered what the steps are to creating concept art for video games? How do you go from a completely blank canvas to something like this? Well, my name is Ellie Cooper and I'm the creative director at Athena Productions, a concept art and visual development studio working on some of the very best video games, films and TV shows of today. And this is our new video series, How to Create Concept Art for Video Games. Let's get started. Whenever we start a project, we always start with a brief. And I recommend having a brief even if it's for personal work. It just allows you to collate all of your thoughts, your inspirations, photos, videos, any references you want to use, anything like that. And it just will help you from the very get-go have a direction that you are aiming towards. Without it, for example, if you had a brief and all it said was exterior casino architecture shot, you could go in 50,000 different directions with that. And in the production of concept art, especially for video games, it would just take way too long, and a lot of video games don't have that sort of time to waste. So it's really important to always have a brief that sets out where you're going and what you're needing to do and what you're needing to solve. So for this particular brief, we were wanting to create a map for a first-person modern day shooter, and we wanted to create something that players would enjoy running around in but still have this story that's connected to it. And that's something that you'll find we keep coming back to as we kind of go through this video, is we keep referring to stories, how we want our players to feel and what that does to help to reinforce what we're, the different things that can reinforce that story for us. So we wanted to do a casino that is the hub of wealth and greed. And the person that owns this casino, they are someone who is a war dog and a weapons dealer. And they use the casino as a way to fuel their business. And we wanted to make this casino very exclusive, so only the top 1% of the wealthiest and perhaps the most corrupt people are able to come here. And this place should feel hulking, imposing, like it casts a long shadow and like it's almost a weapon of its own. This should feel like it's a fortress for this person. And as we were gathering photo references, we decided to go more for brutalist architecture. Brutalist architecture is a great architecture style for something like this. If we were using more swooping shapes, more circles, more, soft architecture, soft transitions, it wouldn't convey the feeling that we're wanting it to. We're wanting this to convey the feeling to players that it is unfriendly, it is a dangerous place to be. And if we were using architecture that was more, like I said, swooping, circular, things like that, it becomes more friendly. So we wanted to avoid that. So using brutalist architecture, it uses a lot more sharp corners, sharp shapes, sharp shape language, and that's really what we were focusing on. And we also gathered references from Monaco. Well known for its casinos, it was a great way for us to be able to look at real-world examples of how these places utilize lighting, how they organize and very purposefully design their courtyards. We're creating a piece of architecture that people haven't seen before, but by creating a courtyard that perhaps feels familiar to people, has a pattern, it might, it would be something that players, or rather the viewer, can fall back on as the familiar. So a lot of design is mixing familiar with unfamiliar. So our courtyard was the familiar while the unfamiliar was our architecture. And as we were looking for references, we found some really interesting sculptures. We found lots of sculptures of people that were holding up pillars or holding up edges. And we thought, well, that could be a great way to further tell the story of this architecture, of this map. It almost has this Hades underworld type of feeling where these poor souls that have, through war have built this architecture are now holding it up. They're now holding it up in kind of a purgatory sort of way. And it felt like a really good way to describe, in a kind of not so on the nose, but a kind of subtle message that this person is sending. They are not remorseful at all. And this is a great way for us to be able to further the story, and for us to also bring uniqueness to our building and make it have its own story, its own language, and for it to stand out against any other normal architecture. So depending on the project, you might start with 2D sketches, or you might start 3D sketches, and it's really up to you. We did both in this instance, where we started off doing some 2D sketches that were very rough, very low detail. They're just meant to be a way for us to see the shape language we're using, make sure that the brutalist architecture that we're using is the right language for this building, and just experiment very quickly, very low stakes, and just get our eye in. It can be a great way to get pen to paper in a low risk sort of way that allows you to be creative but not put too much pressure on yourself. And we very quickly were looking at the brutalist architecture, using this blocky shapes, very sharp corners, diagonals, things like that. Nothing in this architecture is meant to be swooping or soft or anything like that. It's almost meant to be a monument, a fortress, and we're really trying to dial into that language very quickly and early on so that we don't waste time. And with concept art, it is really important that we keep time in mind as we're kind of creating these. And even from the very beginning, we are looking at how we can mix in these people that are holding up this building, these sculptures that we're wanting to mix in. And very quickly, we know already that they're going to be our focal point. So we're just experimenting with where they can go on the architecture to best be seen, to best tell the story, and not be lost in the architecture. That's something that's very important, that we don't want them to feel like we've put them in, but nobody realizes they're there, or nobody notices them. We want them to be quite obvious, and to speak to the story of this building. Now that we've finished sketching the 2D elements, we're going to move into 3D. And something that we really like to use early on is something called blockouts. And blockouts are used in video games, and often, if you've ever seen Blocktober, where game developers will share very early blockouts of a level, and it's a great way to show gameplay before any more detailed 3D models come in. So it's a good way to show gameplay, like I said, layout, scale, and other things like that. It's just a great way to really quickly get your eye in without getting into details. It's kind of like going from big shapes to small shapes, and that's kind of what we're doing here as well. So we're starting to block out using Blender the architecture and just kind of see where it takes us as we go along. And of course, we already have our starting sketches that we used with the 2D, so that gives us a really good reference point of where to head first. Very early on, we also establish a camera angle. We're wanting to do a camera angle that establishes this concept, to establish this architecture and just the general map. We're not wanting to go at eye level yet. We're wanting to just take a look at the architecture as a whole. And we're also starting to look at as well, very early on, how the lighting will affect this building. We wanted it to have very contrasting shadows and highlights and things like that, and establishing it really early on will help you design around it and kind of keep that in mind. So you're almost art directing from the very beginning, even when it's just basic blocks and shapes. And we also use things like satellite imagery to help us with scale. So for example, we've taken here a satellite image of a parking lot just to give us a better idea of scale, and it can be a really helpful way just to establish that early on. And I really recommend as well, whenever you start any project, whether it's architecture, an environment, anything at all, always add in a human scale. So you could use a model in a T-pose, a ArcViz textured model, that's fine as well. It's just super important to get that in the beginning, because if you don't and you keep designing, you might find that a window's off, or the door is too huge or too small for people, and that's where little things can creep in. So always use a a scaled human. It can even be a block that's the right height for a human. It's just always important to get that scale in early on so that you're not having to fix issues later. It will save you so much time in the long run. So you can see that very early on, like I said, we're experimenting with lighting. At the moment, this is too dark. We'll not be able to see any of the front of the architecture. So we're just going to play around a little bit more with the lighting, making sure that we kind of get that ambient light as well from the skylight, and just making sure that it kind of lights up more of the architecture as well. And you can really see that the shape's starting to come here. You know, this feels like a fortress. It feels like it's got this sharp architecture, and this is kind of what we want to see early on. These kind of, you know, you wouldn't hand this into a client necessarily, you know, this is very early days, but this is a good indicator of where you're going, and just being really loose even early on with this 3D by using blocks and things like that can save you a lot of time. I'm going to look at getting our focal point in, and these are our hero elements, the people that we want to be holding up the building. So we're just going to use some human models, and using the plugin called Rigify, we're going to add a rig to it and then pose it. And we're going to add 3s or 5s of these characters. So we're going to make sure that we have 3 or 5 of them in the scene at any point, because if we have, you know, 4, for example, it creates this odd symmetry, this awkwardness to the image. So it's something that you see as well in other industries such as interior design, where they'll say 3s or 5s of pillows, and it's just a way for us to not have this symmetry. And we're also going to make sure that we very subtly change the pose of each character here, so that it just feels a little bit different, so that they don't feel like they have been duplicated, so it feels a bit more natural, a bit more organic. And we're also going to decimate them as well, so that they don't have this kind of soft edges to them. We want them to feel like they are part of the architecture, so having these sharp shapes, these corners that are quite sharp, and these diagonals, just like the architecture. Otherwise they will stick out like a sore thumb, and that's what we don't want. So using textures, we're able to create things such as windows. So we're able to create, you know, this glow to the windows and make sure that that is in. And using array tools and things like that, we're able to very quickly add things in, like the window frames. And we're also starting to focus as well on the courtyard. We had references before of how it's very intentionally designed, and that's something that we want to do as well. We want people to, as they drive up to this building, to feel the intentionality in everything that is done here, and that's kind of what we're aiming for. And very early on, we were playing around with the idea of gardens that were very meticulously done, almost like they are, you know, the Palace of Versailles sort of gardens, you know, this kind of dichotomy between the fact that this person is growing a garden but has people holding up the building, that it's almost got this odd edge to it. And we kind of are playing around with those ideas very early on, and this is what sketches are for, to try out ideas and realize that actually they're not helpful towards gameplay, or no, they're not what we're looking for. And that's kind of the beauty of sketches, is that it's supposed to be a quick way for you to experiment with different ideas in a, you know, in a non time consuming way. And here we're starting to add in our narrative path. So we're adding in here our sculpture for the courtyard, and you can see here where we've kind of got this almost like explosion that's happening around the around the sculpture here, or rather around the kind of character that's in the middle there, and it's almost kind of this abstract sort of way, and this kind of subtle nod to what happens here, of who owns this building. And it's just a reminder to everyone who drives up to this building what this is. And that's kind of what it's all about, really, is designing these elements that keep nodding back to the story, that keep informing the player how to feel, that keep reinforcing the language that we're going for, so that it makes a cohesive whole at the end. Also duplicating some of the characters that we were using to hold up the building around different parts of the architecture as well. They're not as large as our primary ones, but they kind of go to reinforce this narrative so that it's not just in one random area. We've kind of duplicated it to try and get this rhythm throughout the building. And it's important as well to remember that you don't have to design, the whole 360 of this building. Players aren't going to necessarily see the back of it, or in this specific instance, we're not needing to design the back of it. So designing the back would just be a waste of time. So try and think about areas that you need to focus more time on and areas that aren't going to be seen by the camera or the player or aren't needed at this point. So when we're ready, we're going to take our 3D render into Photoshop. And we're going to start working on the black and white sketches. And this part is just a good way for us to overpaint any little details that we're not happy with, push the depth of the image so that we make sure that the background, midground and foreground are all split nicely, replace anything such as the ocean, for example, with a better texture to better sell what it is, and just make general improvements before we hand it off to the client to give them a good idea of what this will look like when we're finished. The 3D render, yes, it looks great, but it's not enough, and we need to kind of have that over painting phase just to improve it. And that's something that we'll even do when we go into color. It will still go from Blender or whatever program we might be using or you might be using to something into Photoshop, so that we can just push it that little bit more to 100%. At the end of our sketching process, we have 3 black and white sketches that we're able to present to the client. And each one has that strong brutalist architecture that we spoke about in the beginning. They all have this very sharp shape language, and they all don't have any swooping details. If there's ever any kind of swooping, or perhaps where suddenly the architecture might suddenly drop off, it has a lot of diagonal lines, a lot of sharp transitions and things like that. We've also included things like the characters that are holding up the building, so that we reinforce this story of this building being made off of very corrupt, very evil money. And that's kind of what we're always trying to bring into an image, these storytelling elements that help to inform our design. And we've also made the courtyard so that it's very organized. There is this very obvious path for players to take up to the building. It's very obvious where the entrance is. There is no mistaking it. And we've tried to keep both the entrance and our focal point with the characters holding up the building on thirds of the composition, so that your eye is always drawn to either or. And especially since the courtyard, it's always leading you from the side or the bottom. It always kind of guides your eye to the entrance, and it's all about trying to design these moments where you're trying to guide the player, guide the viewer's eye, and trying to make them feel a certain way, trying to tell a story. There's a lot that goes into design apart from just making very pretty images. It's all about making these really conscious decisions, and that's kind of what we're trying to achieve in these sketches from a very, very early stage. And it's now up to the client to decide which one they like and which one they want to move forwards with, whether that means mixing some elements from different sketches together or just choosing one on its own. I hope that was an informative way for you to be able to see our sketching process and how we move from a blank canvas through to a final sketch for a client. And we will be taking one of these sketches through to a color version. So if you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe for future content from Athena Productions. See you later.